Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Ani Tubaji and I'm very happy to welcome you in this short overview about my module, Culture-Based Development. This is a module which is targeted for audience that has already some background in economics, but it is designed in a way to allow people also to get on board with the methodology that we will be using in the module, and then to glide along no matter what their actual starting point in economics is. So you might be a person who is third year in a bachelor degree, or you might be in a master degree. You might be from a different background in a master degree, and you can still enjoy and take a lot of insight and participate actively in this module. So the module is presenting a new research paradigm within economics and within the new cultural economics field. This paradigm is called culture-based development, and I have pioneered and elaborated it. For the last over 10 years I'm working on it. It was my PhD topic, and the beginning of it was the research that I did during this period in Germany, and now I keep working as a researcher mainly in this paradigm. The philosophy of the module is to share with you exactly what inspires me the most in economics. I want to make research-based teaching, and there you go. The slide that you see at the moment shows the background literature which is the inspiration of my research and of the module that we are about to go through in a minute. So what is culture-based development? Why it is useful and something that you might be interested in? A lot of attention has been paid to culture in economics. From the very beginning, it was the apple of discord. Economics started as a moral philosophy and was trying to understand which are the right values and the right decisions according to the right values that we have about having a fair world. Then things moved dramatically to a moment in economics as a science when value-free analysis was emulated. And later on, in the last few decades, it has been recognized very intensively by the field of new cultural economics and outside of it, of course, that culture matters. Okay? What does this mean? It means that every model that does not account for culture is essentially underspecified, is biased. Every choice that human beings do contains certain cultural constraints. Okay? And if you do not factor in that, you can never predict really precisely what will be the choice and the aggregate outcome that the society will make. So to cure this cultural bias of every economic model, we have to engage with culture and to understand how properly to define, measure, and incorporate it in the economic model. And that's what culture-based development does. So on top of this, everybody says culture matters and let's put culture in the model, but what makes culture-based development a paradigm is that it has a specific approach to the quantification of culture. It's not only quantification, but before this there is conceptualization and understanding of culture as a complex entity. This conceptualization builds on what we know from other sciences such as sociology, anthropology, cultural theory, and so on and so forth, with two main inspirations, and these are Pierre Bourdieu and Max Weber. And based on them, I define culture as a capital. Now, this is something very different from other approaches to culture, who that try to theorize and to conceptualize culture as a good, okay, as a common good, for instance. Culture-based development strictly talks about culture as a capital. Okay, that's inspired partially by Pierre Bourdieu, who recognizes cultural capital on individual level, but culture-based development conceptualizes cultural capital as a capital that can be possessed also by groups and by places. And then culture-based development analyzes the interaction between the cultural capital of the individual and the cultural capital of all contexts, all places where this individual can get engaged. Based on this interaction, the complexity of the cultural bias is created, and since everybody possesses cultural capital, we are able to start talking about the margins of culture and cultural capital. We can make analysis on the margins by looking at the distance between the cultural capitals that are possessed by the entities. So once we have identified what is the source of the cultural bias, that this is the cultural capital, and we know that the effect from cultural capital can be identified on the margins looking at the cultural distances, what is also important to account for is that culture is a complex entity, meaning cultural capital cannot be approximated just with one single variable. There is a particular way that you have to acknowledge the complexity of culture. Culture can be reduced meaningfully in its complexity into two main subcomponents, which have a temporal divide. The one is cultural heritage, and the other is living culture. So the cultural heritage part is obviously coming from a different period, and with regards to the period of investigation is exogenous. The living culture, however, is an endogenous component. Now, both these parts of culture can change over time. They have a dynamics, and this dynamic change is particularly important because the way that they are balanced determines the qualitative difference of the capital and the magnitude with which it can impact the choice, the economic choice. So culture-based development differs from all other paradigms and approaches to culture in this recognition of culture as a capital, identification of the impact of culture on the margin in terms of the cultural distance between entities, and then accounting for the complexity of the composition of the cultural capital. And this is a particularly useful and important value added to the economic knowledge, because it allows to incorporate then culture in its full essence into the model. If you do not do this, if you use only one proxy for culture, it may be an over-reduction. It can under-quantify what culture is as a factor for the economic choice and for the economic model, and then you think that you have accounted for culture, but in fact you are still under-specifying your model because you're under-quantifying your main important factor that we all agree nowadays that it matters, culture. Okay? So by adopting the culture-based development approach, you can indeed increase both the accuracy of the model that it accounts for culture and its real precision, to avoid the underspecification of culture and the quantification. And then you can apply this cultural augmentation of the economic models to virtually any kind of economic model, and all models in the economic realm, as long as they depend on human decision making, they are sensitive to the cultural bias. That's why this module is on the forefront of economic science. It's really a cutting edge approach to making our models more accurate and more precise in economic research, and I demonstrate for you the applications in microeconomics with regards to migration choice, innovation. Then we go on the meso level and look at regional development and the redistribution of growth across regions, how it depends on the cultural bias, and ultimately we go into the realm of voting and cooperation on aggregate level. So these are selected applications, but the application of CBD can go much beyond that. That's why you should be interested, I think, in this module if you're interested in predicting the economic choice and using it for both academic, scientific purposes and for policy making. Now, which are the topics that the module covers? There are 10 topics which would correspond to 10 lectures. The first among them is the introductory lecture, which covers the period from Adam Smith to culture-based development, with an accent on the role of culture in the economic thought. So this is what the lecture is about. It gives this huge overview, which is based on already existing and still under construction papers by me, which are big literature reviews on the topic. And the seminar of this first lecture is essentially mini lecture on the methods, which are mostly game theoretical and empirical methods, which are the necessary tools for following the rest of the lectures. Okay, so that's why, while it will be easiest for you to understand this if you've already been trained in game theory and in econometrics, I make sure that the basics which are necessary for following the whole course are delivered to you in the first seminar related to the first lecture. And then there are 9 more lectures which are divided into 3 slots. The first deals with understanding how culture-based development conceptualizes and measures the cultural capital, and how it deals with its entity, which is dynamic over time and space. So these are first the lecture on what is cultural capital, then how this cultural capital can be used then in order to establish the distance between individuals, the distance between places, and how you have to modify it in order to measure accurately and precisely the cultural capital of a person who moves between places and clubs and groups. Then, based on the composition of the cultural capital, one can make an analysis of the so-called cultural entropy. So I told you that there is this main reduction of the complexity of cultural capital into cultural heritage and living culture, and one can check to what extent the living culture and cultural heritage are balanced, and this is what the measure of entropy serves for. I will give a small flavor of this particular lecture a little bit later in this introduction. Then, after we have established the main definitions essentially in culture-based development with regards to culture, now we will have a glimpse in 3 separate lectures into the application of this cultural capital and the way that it cures cultural bias. In the case of cognition and discrimination, the taste of discrimination in specific, which normally is applied as originally offered by Gary Becker, with the understanding that the taste for discrimination is exogenous. Unlike this, culture-based development makes this taste for discrimination a function of the already explained endogenous cultural capital. Okay. Then we apply again cultural capital in order, and this distance between people and between people and places, in order to generate a measure of what is called cultural gravity of a place. And then we did to explain both the migration patterns and the innovation that happens in the recipient countries. Ultimately, there is a more aggregate version of this effect of the cultural bias in the form of cultural frictions. So, in the standard model for spatial frictions, culture is a static part of the model. In the culture-based development version, it becomes a dynamic, stochastic element of the process, and itself is a source, an important source of frictions that cause the redistribution of growth across regions. And after this basic part of the actual choices in discrimination, the choices that have a practical outcome for the concentration of human capital and for the innovation, research and development in places which are main triggers for growth. And ultimately, the cultural bias in the redistribution of the produced growth gives a real nice snapshot of how cultural bias can be cured with the application of culture-based development in economic choice. The next level of lectures will deal with the more extended application of the culture-based development. The first one shows the relationship of the cultural bias with altruistic inclinations, which are the fundament also of voting behavior. I show how the culture-based development explains the dissolving of the contract curve due to perceptions of relative deprivation, and this bias is culturally motivated because people have a perception of relativity which is associated with the clubs to which they culturally belong. And then when the contract curve regarding altruism dissolves, people start polarizing and start voting for extreme parties. And this is both theoretically and empirically illustrated. And ultimately, the cultural clubs are defined, and the culture-based development of approach to these cultural clubs is applied to explain religious clubs and cooperation, or the lack of cooperation between clubs that are expected to be cooperating infinitely, since they believe in infinite life. Which specific game theoretical application also tell us what are the implications of culture and cultural clubs for great transformations in political and economic terms. This is the main body of material that will be delivered on CBD. And the last lecture will give a glimpse of other related studies from new cultural economics, which are in a nice dialogue and open further pathways for extending the CBD approach and continuing the research with the use of this paradigm. So these are the 10 topics. And what you have hopefully to be able to explain after you complete this module, in other words, your learning outcomes, have the following 5 aspects. First, you should be able to explain how and why the model, any economic model, is underspecified when culture is not using the culture-based development approach. So you have to understand, in other words, why culture is important for the model and why it has to be measured as a complex entity, complex dynamic entity, rather than approximated with a single proxy. You have to be able to explain how the cultural bias is particularly quantified in culture-based development through the use of cultural theory and a notion of cultural capital, but adapted for economic analysis, adapted for regional and group level. Then it should be also knowledge that you have gained from this module, the knowledge on this, how to explain cultural entropy and how to use this notion in order to explain the endogeneity in the economic process. You should be able also to use culture as and the culture-based development as lens through which you see club theory and membership theory. You should be able to compare them, and you should be able to explain how culture is essentially main tool for creating clubs. Okay, and hence everything which we know from club theory and from membership theory can be interpreted as cultural bias. And ultimately, the module helps you to make sense how the micro and the macro world link, because very small changes in the cultural preferences are able to generate huge differences in the development of the system, and you will be able to identify these small changes based on the cultural entropy and to explain the process respectively as a complex dynamic system that depends on the cultural preference. So these are basic understandings about culture, which have their extensions to really important theories and approaches in modern economic thinking. Some of them, such as the complexity, are revolutionary economic thinking. Others are related more with game theoretical approaches. But all of them have the common fundament that they correct the already existing models, theoretical models, and they augment them with culture and make them hence more accurate and more precise. And then, if this is what you will learn and you already know the topics, what is the philosophy of teaching here? So every lecture is structured in the following manner. You first take the basic model, you deliver the basic model to refresh it in the mind of those who know it, or to introduce those students who haven't had very intensive economic training in the beginning, so that they know what the model looks like without culture, before culture is introduced. Then I explain the culture-based development version of the model, the same model, now augmented with the cultural capital component. And ultimately, we go through this CBD adjustment, not only in the lecture, but also we see an application of a research based on a paper of culture-based development during the seminar, and we discuss further, and the students have the opportunity to reuse some data sets which I have used in my own research, and to engage with replicating the research that I have done. So this is how they can see the model working without the cultural component, and the model working with the cultural component, which is the difference between the performance of the two models. In the next several slides, I will give you a small flavor of 3 lectures, okay? So that you see how these cultural augmentation of the model exactly works. So the first one will be about cultural entropy, so the first set of lectures. The cultural entropy is, of course, not exactly a model, it is just a measure, but now let's see how exactly I modify with culture-based development the standard approach to cultural entropy. As I told you, according to culture-based development, the cultural capital has a complex structure, and it can be reduced meaningfully to cultural heritage, noted here with CH, and living culture. Now, these can be material and immaterial, but the main distinction, temporarily considered, is cultural heritage and living culture, and this is essential for distinguishing between what is exogenous to the current moment of time and what is endogenous to the current production of living culture. Cultural heritage is obviously things such as museums, such as monuments, such as fairy tales, etc., songs inherited from the past. And living culture is things of the same nature but produced nowadays. And of course, what is produced nowadays depends on investment, and therefore it is endogenous to the economic process. What one can do, of course, is just take a proxy for all these things by taking one random example of what I just listed and see what it's count. This is what most research in economics does, something that approximates culture. But if you choose, let's say, the count of churches, this obviously does not take into consideration how many discos necessarily you have today, or even how many books are published in a particular place nowadays, because a place in the past might have been very religious, but it might have collapsed nowadays economically, and the investment in cultural materials there might be completely different. So they're not, cultural heritage and living culture are not directly correlated. They might have different stocks in the different periods of time, and from this the dynamics of the cultural capital is born. The cultural capital dynamics, however, happens much slower. The change in culture happens much slower than the change in the economic process, because once something is created in culture, it remains recorded in its cultural heritage. So that's how the cultural capital, while endogenous, is not entirely driven by the economic process. It has a nature of its own, which has a different pattern from a much longer period of time. So what is important is to reduce this cultural capital in its complexity of many sub-items, to reduce it to these two types, basic types, cultural heritage and living culture. This is very useful because cultural entropy is a measure which measures the balance between the subcomponents of an entity. Now, cultural entropy in itself has been studied in economics many times, in different ways, and especially in culture it has been also applied many times. You see, for the first time entropy was used by Georgescu Roger, the Romanian scientist who introduced the concept in economics, and then it has been applied in different versions in regional economics by Nycom and Righiani, later on by Boschma and Franke, from which the whole stream of literature on related and unrelated variety in industries exists nowadays. You can use entropy measure to see how balanced is the economic structure between the different types of industries that you might have in a locality. That's how it is used, and then you can go to different levels of subtypes within each industry and so on. So this is the difference between related and unrelated variety. The measure of cultural entropy in economics has been used also to measure culture, but it has been used in this reductionist way where you use only one proxy. And there is one very important paper by Desmet and co-authors which is focused exactly on this problem. So Desmet demonstrates that if you use diversity in terms of racial diversity, and then if you use the measure of entropy, and then you can compose another measure of entropy which is focused on the different attitudes that people have, the two diversity measures are cultural diversity, but when you put them on the map they look completely different. Things which seem racially close in terms of attitudes might be very much culturally different, and vice versa. So the main take of this paper is what are we exactly measuring when we are using entropy measure for culture. And this is another way to agree with the culture-based development statement from 2014 that every model is underspecified if this model tries to use only a single proxy for culture, because a single proxy for culture is always under quantifying the cultural measure. So how culture-based development uses the cultural entropy measure in a more advanced manner? Well, it uses the cultural heritage and the living culture as the two subtypes which will be introduced in the standard formula for Shannon entropy. And what we know about this standard formula, which you will see here, is that when it has two subtypes, then this measure varies between 0 and 1. The max is 1, the minimum entropy is 0. So when we have a perfect balance between cultural heritage and living culture, the Shannon entropy will be equal to 1. And then when it tends towards 0, it means that either the cultural heritage component or the living culture component is predominant. And through an interaction term in the empirical model, we can understand which of them is dominating and how this dominance is influencing the outcome of interest. So then we can engage this measure in order to understand the way that, for instance, innovation is being determined across space. Because if you have first decision maker who is taking the decision whether to invest in an idea or not, and if this person is 50% likely to be cultural heritage and 50% likely to be living culture. This is particularly important because we know that the cultural heritage person is a person who will invest in the decision only if the decision is coming from a cultural heritage identical to him, innovator. And if it is a living culture, so if it is a person from a different cultural background, who is different from the cultural heritage of the investor will refuse to invest in this idea. So unlike this type of investor, the living culture type investor is an investor who has in their cultural capital more diverse background, not necessarily one-to-one with the cultural heritage of only of the place where he is based, and this person is equally inclined to invest in cultural heritage and living culture. This propensity is driven from the cultural distance that exists between the decision maker and the people whose ideas he is evaluating. When a place has 50-50 chance to have cultural heritage and living culture investors, this is the situation when the least number of ideas will be affected by the negative choice of the cultural heritage type. The more the percentage of people with cultural heritage background grows, the more we will have ideas coming from people with living culture background being negated just because of the taste for discrimination against them that these decision makers for investment have, right? So that's why the highest entropy of 50-50 between living culture and cultural heritage will be associated with the minimized loss for innovation and maximized potential for innovation of the entire system. Now, having this as a theoretical understanding for what is the meaning of cultural entropy for the innovation process, we can take this empirically to the regions of Europe, and what you see here is a map of what is the cultural heritage, what is the living culture distribution across the regions of Europe, and then you see that the cultural entropy, where the living culture and cultural heritage are most balanced, and how they are balanced is having a life and a geography of its own. The cultural entropy doesn't coincide with the living culture and the cultural heritage. And what this lecture does is it introduces the cultural entropy measure and the history of it in economic thought, especially in terms of its role for measuring culture. Then it shows how the cultural capital can be measured in its complexity through the use of cultural entropy. What is the theoretical implication? During the seminar, we go into this particular application of the cultural entropy measure for measuring the cultural entropy across the regions of Europe on NUTS2 level, and then explaining the local levels of innovation with the local levels of cultural entropy and a full model for innovation. So this is one example for a lecture of the first three sets of topics. Now about the meso-level, the friction. This lecture is based on the classical work of Rossi, Hansberg and Wright, which is explaining what are frictions in the spatial model. To sum this up in a simple way, we have the decision whether to go to a place or not, driven by the costs of going there, the endowments of the place, and the moving costs that you have to implement this decision. Once these factors balance off each other, parts of human capital are driven from one place to migrate to another place, and they carry with themselves the potential for growth. Therefore, growth gets distributed towards the places where the people are migrating. In this model, the cultural endowment is something which is just a characteristic which is not changing dynamically and stochastically. This is what culture-based development changes in the model. It says that the cultural endowment of places is actually something that can change in its composition over time, and it can take different values which are predicted by the behavior of people and the choice of people. They can recalibrate these, and so it's a stochastic thing what will happen. Essentially, it's difficult to predict what will happen because people are choosing what kind of culture to invest now. Currently, it might or might not be correlated with what was the previous level of investment in culture. So how does this work? Well, there is a paper of mine in the Journal of Regional Studies, which is going through the creation of cultural frictions. Essentially, this little diagram here sums up the gist of it. You have the cultural capital. When it is unbalanced, and the entropy is more driven by the living culture being the bigger share, this creates a higher social capital in the local place, higher propensity to cooperate, higher propensity to select any type of investor. That's a milieu that is favorable for different types of human capital, and of course more types of human capital flock towards this locality. Then the opposite, when you have a disbalanced cultural heritage and living culture, where the cultural heritage is the dominant component of the local cultural capital, this means that only people of the local cultural heritage are the ones that can enjoy the cooperative spirit of this place, and hence this means a social capital that is more clubistic, more restrictive, more excluding other types of human capital, and respectively people from different cultural background other than the local are not attracted, are pushed away from these localities over time. And again, the redistribution of human capital in the classical way that we know from spatial frictions drives the redistribution of economic growth through space, and the particular application was passing through the nexus of inequality, which will be the way that we will look at it during the seminar. And this is the citation of the particular article which presents this study and where the diagram comes from. And the last example, the last flavor of a lecture that I will give here in this overview is related to the application of culture-based development on the dissolving of the contract curve. And then particular example how this is relevant for voting. So if our contract curve is reminded first to the students, this is essentially a situation where you have the decision how to agree on the consumption of two goods by matching the preferences of the one person in the negotiation process with the indifference curves of the other, the places where the indifference curves of the two partners have an equal solution, have a marginal rate of substitution that is equal for both partners. We have these tangent points which shape the contract curve. Now, this way of thinking can be reinterpreted in the following way. The two types of goods, X and Y, can be thought of as individual consumption and charitable behavior, charitable giving to the others. Okay, so if you give your entire income to others, and if you use your entire income for individual consumption, this is what the two partners have to agree upon. Now, this is, in my view, the most important contract which stays behind voting, because our different political systems differ mainly on the understanding whether the individual interest or the pro-social behavior are the more important ones. When people are able to have a contract curve of some kind of agreement on these things, they will be voting for parties which are more center-oriented. When the contract curve between altruistic and individual self-interest behavior completely disintegrates between two individuals, they'll start voting for two completely different polar parties. And in specific, the person who is relatively deprived will be tending towards claiming more towards a pro-distributive system, and the person who is related to the more prosperous side, more advantageous, privileged side, will go in the other extreme of the spectrum for voting. Now, why will this curve disintegrate? Well, culture-based development shows here the importance of the club. When you belong to one club and the other person belongs to another club, the characteristics of prosperity for your clubs is what is a source for relative deprivation in you. This is a way of reinterpreting the cooperative behavior, which has connections to the tunnel effect by Rothschild, and it shows that when your group is losing, is perceived as relatively losing, you break the rules. Why do you break the rules? Here is the theoretical explanation. In order to have your marginal rate of substitution, the marginal rate of substitution of the other person equal, you have to perceive the situation identically. The easiest way to explain this, before we take it to the cultural clubs, is to see how relative deprivation works when it is in terms of income. So if person A has an income which is lower than person B, otherwise they are completely identical, they have desire to cooperate, and they're good people, so to speak. Now, for every curve here, for every point of this curve here up to here, they can agree, because with his income, A can afford that amount of X to consume, or can give everything for charity to the extent of Y. For B, essentially these additional amounts here are also attainable with his higher income, but the part of the contract curve that corresponds to this income is simply not feasible for A. So from the perspective of A, the part CB simply automatically dissolves. So they cannot agree on it, because A cannot consume that much and cannot give more than they have for charitable action. Then we can say, okay, then the space for finding the for a contract curve has contracted, the world has become smaller. But the case is actually worse, because for every of these points here, the marginal rate of substitution is one and the same. However, the perception that Y has, because Y knows that B has an income that is bigger than their own, is that in each of these points, the relative amount that the charitable action represents as a percentage of B's income is always smaller in reality than what this same charitable action will mean as a percentage from A's own income. So none of these points will be perceived as the same marginal rate of substitution. And this perception is the reason why they cannot find any point at which A will see the actions of B as having the same marginal rate of substitution. No contract curve will be shaped between them, and they will go into opposite directions. The same logics with a little bit more complex analysis can be done when the relative deprivation concerns the group to which you're belonging to, and not only your own direct income difference with the other side, but the main principle is the same. So an application of this in the seminar is given with the relative deprivation of people who decide to switch from the standard religion and to self-identify as witches, because they see no longer the presence of a contract curve with the other members of society, and how the presence of such people in a place, how the concentration of people of this subversive religious identification in a place signals for the local disintegration of the contract curve of altruism, and predicts the Brexit vote in Britain in specific. So this was what the lectures are about and what they engage you with. Now let's see how the assessment is structured. 45% of your participation in this course will be summatively assessed based on 3 in-class tests. I want to understand that you are learning the concepts, that you are learning the methods, that you are learning how to do culture-based development research. And I will be telling you whether you're learning or whether you're not learning, so that if you're not learning well, you can ask me, you can revisit the learning materials, and you can learn the things correctly. You can build a correct fundament for making culture-based analysis. And then 55% of the work will be a coursework, which will be formative. You will be allowed to implement your own culture-based development research, will be invited to make this kind of research independently, but then you will be given a formative feedback from me as to whether you did it well, which parts could have been done differently, how you could have made things better, or potentially, if you have done an excellent job, how could you extend this further and bring it to a next level. It will be a real joy for me to have this module and to share it with students, because I believe that research-led teaching is the best way, the most enthusiastic way, the most inspiring way for the students and for the teachers for this beautiful process of education. So thank you very much for the attention, and hope to see you among the people studying culture-based development. Bye-bye.